Now we're going to talk about curves, and you might have already heard about curves before because they are fairly popular. You'll find them in a lot of software these days, including Lightroom. So let's go ahead and dive in and see what they're all about. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this image here, and let's go down to the tone curve submodule here. So in here you can see we have this square, and inside the square we have in the background something that looks pretty much like the histogram up above here, and we have a line overlaid on top of it. And this line is the actual tone curve. Now you can see as I move my cursor across it, it highlights different sections, and we go from lights to darks to shadows. Up here we had highlights, and we have the corresponding sliders down below here. And the reason this is called a curve, now even though this is a straight line, what I can do is I can click on these different areas down here and adjust the way that line looks. So let's say, for example, I click on the highlights and I drag it all the way over to the right. Now you can see in this image, it only affected the highlight areas of the image. So the sky, the sand down here, those all really increased in contrast and intensity, whereas the background, these rocks, this sand back here, and in the foreground even weren't really affected at all. And that's what tone curves do. They affect the contrast of the image. So you can choose different areas of the image to affect and really make your image pop with a tone curve. So let's go in and explore this a bit more. If we take the highlights all the way down to the opposite side, you can see we lose all the contrast in the sky and in the foreground here in this light sand area. And that really makes our image look flat. So I'm gonna put this back to where it started. So let's go ahead and do something a little more extreme. If we take the lights and we drag them all the way to the top, and we take the darks and we drag them all the way to the bottom, now you can see my curve is looking a lot more like an S, but look at my image. This is not something that I want my image to look like. This is way too strong, has way too much contrast. So you don't literally want to make an S out of your curve. You want to make it look a little bit more gradual. So let's bring our darks back up to maybe minus 20 or so, and our lights up to plus 20 or so. And now you can see the image is looking a lot better. If we go over here to where we started, when we deleted that adjustment, you can see the before and after is very drastic. And keep in mind, you can also view this change by clicking this little switch up here and turn those adjustments on and off. So that's just a quick overview of how the curves work. Let's go ahead and explore some of the other areas of this submodule. So if we look back up here, you'll see a few other things I didn't mention. We have this little round circle thing, and we have these arrows underneath the tone curve. So I'm going to start out with this circle. And what this is, you'll see this in a lot of different places in Lightroom. And what it allows you to do is bring this basically tool out and select an area of your image that you want to affect. And you can see as I move the tool across the image, the point is being highlighted here on the curve that I'm hovering over. So you can see now I'm in the darks, here I'm over here in the lights. So if I wanted to say just the darks just a little bit more, I can click on this and I can drag up or down. So if I drag down, I'm going to drag that curve down from that point, or if I drag up, I'm going to drag the curve up from that point, and you can see the dark slider is being affected as well. So this is a really good way that if you want to affect just a particular area of your image and you don't know which sliders to move, you can just drag this over and move it around a little bit. So let's just go ahead and leave that there and look at one more part of this tone curve. Now we've got these three triangles underneath, and you can use these if you want to subtly shift the curve. So if I click on this middle one, you can see as I drag it to the right and to the left, it does affect the image, but it also shifts the entire curve. So if I wanted to do that, instead of just clicking on one of these sliders and affecting just a certain part of the curve, I can go ahead and just drag these triangles down below and subtly shift the curve a little bit. Now, one other thing I do want to point out is if I don't want to use these sliders, if I want to click directly on the curve here, I can do that, and I can pull it down or I can pull it up, and I can change the way the image looks and change the shape of the curve just by doing that. So it's whichever you prefer, the sliders or dragging directly on the curve, or even using this tool and dragging parts of the image, it's all going to do the same thing. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and reset all of these by double clicking on the word. And now that they're back to 0, I'm going to talk about this section down here. So we have this point curve. And if I click on this, we're going to have a lot of options. Now you probably won't see all of these options at the bottom because these come with those Visco presets that I have installed. You might only have these top 3, but these are really what I want to talk about right now. So if I click on medium contrast, you can see it gave me a slight S curve up here, but it didn't do anything down here to these sliders. And the reason for that is it basically says, well, if I want medium contrast in the image, here's the shape of the curve you want. And then I still have total control over these sliders down here if I want to fine tune it some more. So I can still go in, I can adjust the lights, I can adjust the darks, and I can add more contrast to this image. And if that's still not enough, if I reset these, I can go and I can use the strong contrast, and you can see that gives me a much stronger contrast. But again, I still have all of the flexibility of adjusting these to really fine tune how this curve affects my image. So one more thing I have to talk about is this lower right hand box here. So I'm going to reset my curve back to linear and jump into this. So just by clicking on it, it brings up a different curve here. And we don't have the sliders down below anymore, but what this is a point curve. So what I can do is I can click on individual parts of the image or of the curve here and click them and completely adjust just separate sections of the curve. So if I wanted to do something like this, when I drag here on this, it doesn't affect anything below this point. So it only affects this portion of the curve. And that's really great. You can really fine tune your image if you want to, but I'm gonna go ahead and undo those because I do want to show you something else. So this is back to where it started. And if I want to, this extreme lower left part of this curve is basically the blacks in the image. And if I click on this, and I drag it upwards, you can see it's really, really lightening the image. So basically my blacks are getting lighter and lighter. And if I go back here and drag to the right, you can see my blacks and darks are getting darker and darker. So this is a great way to affect how blacks look in your image. And the same thing up here, this is the whites. So if I drag to the left, things get brighter and brighter. And if I drag down, things get darker and darker. So you can affect the overall look of your image really drastically with this. And again, we can go in here, ignore all these, and if we have the medium contrast curve, you can see how it's been applied. Each of these points has been added to create a medium contrast curve. So that's pretty much curves in a nutshell. I would suggest just sticking with this portion and using these sliders to affect your curve. Once you go in here, you can definitely have more control, but you can also do a lot more damage, and it gets really complicated if you get too many points on here. So I would just say stick in here and definitely explore the curves tool. It's very powerful and a great way to make your images look good. So let's move on down the list to the next submodule here. And you can see we have a lot of colored sliders, and across the top we have this HSL, color, and black and white. So this HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about what these do. Now, if you don't want to see all of these at the same time, the first thing you can do is just click on hue, and that's only going to show you this hue section. Same with saturation and luminance. I'm just going to go ahead and expand them all for now. And let's start out with this first section, which is hue. Now, what is hue? Well, you might have heard the term before, and it generally refers to colors. So if we take this little sample tool here and we go and let's go ahead and see if we can adjust the hue of this sand in the foreground. So if I click on this and drag it up and down, you can see it's drastically changing the color of the sand itself. And if you look at the sliders over there on the right hand side, you can see both the red and the orange sliders are being adjusted. So what's happening here is you can see the color gradient throughout here. So it goes basically from like a magenta up to yellow, and on the different ones, they basically affect different parts of the color. So for example, if I go in the blue and I click on it, if I don't want to click on the image and I just want to affect the blues, you can see the sky is drastically changing colors. It goes from this more aqua color to a more purple color, and that's just simply by dragging this back and forth. So this is one way you can affect individual colors within your image. Now, one thing to point out, if I use this sample tool and I go back up here in the sky and I click and drag, then you can see both the blue and the aqua are changing. And that's the sliders on the right. And what that means is there's not just blue in the sky, there's also some aqua as well. So keep in mind, if you do want to change selected parts of your image, you're probably better off using that selection tool because it might have more than one color. Even if it looks blue, this sky has both blue and aqua in it. So let's go ahead and move on down and check out what saturation does. Before we do that, let me just reset all of these values just so the image looks normal again. And let's play with saturation. So again, let's see if we can affect how this foreground sand looks. And I'm gonna just click on the sample tool again, click here and drag it up and down. And you can see it's mainly affecting the oranges, but the reds a little bit as well. And it is really making it an intense color of orange. So that's not really something I'd want to do, but if I did want to just subtly increase the saturation in that, I can do something like that. And the same thing with the sky. If I go and just adjust the blues, you can see the blue gets really, really dark, or down to basically a black and white sky there. So this is a great way that you can go in and subtly enhance certain parts of your image and their saturation. So let's reset those and move down to the next one here, which is luminance. So finally for luminance, luminance affects the overall brightness of individual colors. So if I go in here, let's do it to the sand again. If I click on this little luminance sampler and I click on the sand here and I drag it up and down, you can see it gets super, super bright, or I can make it super, super dark. So that's one way that you can affect the brightness of individual colors. And the way that this comes in useful, I'm gonna show you by jumping over into another image here. If I have this image of this lady, and I say, you know, it all looks pretty good, but this light on her face is really intense. Let's see if we can drop this down a little bit. If I think the exposure looks good, and I just wanna maybe change how bright her face is, I can drag the luminance down just a little bit, and look at that. It's getting darker, but it's also less bright. So it's something that you want to use in moderation, but it is a way to kind of control the overall brightness of certain colors without affecting the exposure. Now I could go and use a brush in here as well, but I do find myself a lot of times when I'm working with people and I'm working with skin tones, I do use this luminance slider, specifically the reds, the oranges, the yellows, because those are typically the colors that skin has. And I go in and I do make minor adjustments to make people's skin look just a little bit better. So let's jump back over into this image that we were working on, and I want to show you a few more things in this section. So I'm going to go ahead and reset these back to their original settings, and I want to show you one more thing here. So across the original title bar here, we have this HSL, this color, and this black and white. So let's go ahead and see what this next one does. If I click on color, we basically get the same exact thing, but it's for each individual channel. I get the hue, the saturation, and the luminance. And if I want to see all of them, right now red is selected. If I want to see them all, I can click all, and you can see we have all this information here. And keep in mind, this is the exact same thing that we have over here, but instead of having a hue section with red and a saturation section with red and a luminance section with red, we instead have a red section with those three different settings. So it's one way, if you know you're going to be working on just one specific color in your image, you can switch to the color section and just focus on that instead of having to move up and down through a bigger list. So you might find that useful. I personally prefer just using the HSL and viewing everything at the same time. Now, if you notice here, when I go back into the color section, I don't have that little circular selection tool like I have up here. So that's one reason you might want to use this HSL section instead of the color section, just so you can pick specific colors within your image. So let's go ahead and jump into the next section here, which is black and white. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and you can see it instantly converts my image to a black and white image. But you'll notice we still have a little bit of blue up here, and the reason for that is, remember when I added this gradient, on this particular one I added some color. There's actually blue in there. So what I'm going to do, just so this doesn't really confuse things, I'm just going to go in and remove the color by turning this saturation all the way down to 0. And that basically removes all of the blue from this particular filter here. So I'm going to turn those off, and let's jump back in here and get a good idea of how these work. So now let's go ahead and take a look at what these sliders do. Now you'll notice we have all these colors in here, but there's no color in the image. And what's going on is, we know the sky was originally blue, and when I click and drag on this blue slider, it does affect the sky. But what happened is Lightroom has converted all of these different colors into shades of gray. So basically, when I click on these, it doesn't affect the blue in the image, but it affects the areas of the image that were originally blue. And now it's just going to affect the tone and make it either brighter or darker. So let's go ahead, if I want to, I can drag this blue slider down a little, make the sky a little more drastic and intense. And one thing to keep in mind, these sliders might not always work the way you think they will, because you might not remember which areas of the image were originally magenta, for example. Well, that might be a very small portion of the image, and if I click on this and let's drag it back and forth, you can see there's parts of the image that are changing, but you would never know that that's just the magenta. So the best way to do this is going to be to use this selector tool. So what I want to do is I want to go in here and let's make the mountains just a little bit darker, and that's going to mainly change the purple but the magenta a little bit as well. Let's make this background sand a little lighter maybe, and let's make this foreground sand just a little darker. And you can see I'm adding overall contrast to the image, and that looks a lot better than my original settings. When I imported, or when I did this conversion, Lightroom basically guessed on what a good black and white conversion was for this image, and it basically just turned it into black and white, but it didn't really have any pop to it. So what I'm doing now is I'm adjusting a contrast more or less by changing the intensity of these different colors in here. And you can see if I turn this off and on, the before and the after from what I've done and what it looks like now, there is a pretty significant difference. So I could go in here and tweak this a little bit more if I wanted to, but I really just wanted to give you an idea of how it works. So please go in here, explore this tool, convert some of your images to black and white, and play with it a little bit. I highly recommend you use that selection tool so that you're affecting all of the colors in any given part of your image instead of just separate channels. So go ahead, create some black and white images and have some fun. All right, let's go ahead and move on to split toning, but before we do that, I do want to change my image back to color. So I can do that simply by clicking back over here on the HSL, and it goes straight back to the color image that we had. Now I do want to point out, none of these adjustments are lost. So if I go back into black and white, everything is set where I left it, so you can switch back and forth. You can tweak two different versions of the image and have a black and white and a color if you want to. So let's scroll down here to split toning and see what this is all about. Now, as the name implies, split toning splits the image into highlights and shadows, and it affects each of those differently. So let's jump in here and I'll show you what I mean. So in here, everything looks pretty familiar. We have a highlight section with hue and saturation and a shadow section with hue and saturation, and then a balance in the middle. So let's go ahead and jump into a different image and I'll show you exactly how these work. So this image is a great example because it has a lot of really strong highlights up here, and then it has some darker shadow sections as well. So you'll really be able to see how these different sliders affect this image. So what I want to do first is I want to tweak the highlights, and by changing the hue, remember, we have this whole range of colors all the way from red through green, blue. It's basically the rainbow. And the way I like to do it so I can see how strong the image is going to look, or how strong the color is going to look, is I bump my saturation way up to start with. And right now you can see all of the highlights have this strong pinkish red tone. And if I drag this through the spectrum here, I can see it change through all these different colors. And I can really change the look and feel of my image from completely unrealistic to something that is actually fairly realistic looking. This blue looks pretty nice in my sky here, but I kind of want to make it a warm sky. So I'm going to choose something around here. And then I'm going to drop my saturation back down so I can see what effects my shadows have. So I'm going to do the same thing with my shadows. I'm going to turn the saturation way up and kind of drag this through and find a color that looks nice to me. And remember, we are not going for a super strong effect, so we're going to turn the saturation back down. But I kind of like to have my shadows have a more cool tone, so let's go with something like that and turn those all the way down as well. So now we're back to the image we started with, and we can just now go and just slowly add some saturation to the highlights, and you can see that color is creeping in a bit there. And you can also add a little saturation to the shadows, and you can see that is subtly changing. So let's try that. So now I'm going to go up here into the balance, and what the purpose of balance is to find a balance between these highlights and the shadows and find something that looks good to you. So by moving it to the right, I'm giving more priority to the highlights, and you can see the oranges and yellows are really coming out in the sky there. In the foreground, that kind of blue is disappearing. If I move it to the left, You can see the sky is it's losing a lot of that color I added, and a lot more of those blues are coming into the foreground. So in this particular instance, I want to go ahead and leave the sky a little more intense, so let's go with something right around here. So if I want to see what changes I've made, I can go over here and I can turn these off and on again. And I actually don't like the foreground as much. I do like the sky, so I'm just going to drop the saturation out of the foreground, but keep the toning in the sky. And that's one thing you can do with split toning. You don't have to affect both the highlights and the shadows. You can just change one or the other. So keep in mind, split toning is typically used for subtle changes to an image, but you could go crazy. You could go ahead and make a completely green highlighted sky and make all your shadows purple or something like that. But subtle is good in this case, and I'm going to keep it just like this.
The next submodule we're going to talk about is detail. Now within detail, you're going to find two things that you can tweak. One is sharpening and the other is noise reduction. Let's talk about sharpening first. Now in Lightroom, you'll find 3 different places for sharpening images. So it might be a little bit confusing for you to understand how sharpening actually works and how it affects your images. So the first place you're going to find sharpening, and it's probably the most common place to find, is going to be within this detail submodule, right here where it says sharpening. And the most important thing that you need to understand here is that this sharpening is really only relevant for full-size images. So whatever sharpening settings I apply to this particular image, for example, if I'm going to play with a setting here, it's only going to have, unless I go crazy and apply really high settings, it only is going to apply to this full version within Lightroom. Now, why is that important? The reason why it's important is because if you're doing something like exporting images just for web and you're downscaling your images from their high resolution to a low resolution, say something like 1200 pixels wide, for example. In that case, what you can do is you can completely skip this area and move on to output sharpening on the export screen. And the reason why you can do that is because the effect of sharpening here is not going to matter, because during the process of exporting, when it takes a high resolution image and it downsamples it to a very small image, the effect of sharpening is for the most part going to be lost. So in this case, all you have to do then is just use the output sharpening. So that's something to keep in mind. Now there's a third place, which I will show you in a second, where you can also use sharpening for doing selective sharpening. But for now, let's just start in this area right here. So let's jump right into Lightroom and I'm going to show you how this works. So in this case right here, I've got this landscape image, and that's the same one that John was working on. And what I'm going to do, I've got a lot of fine details here, and it's a great candidate for this type of work where we can show the effects of sharpening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you first how this tool works right here. So the nice thing about Lightroom is that you can actually pick a particular area of interest. So if, for example, I say this is the particular area of interest where I can maybe see the effects of sharpening, or maybe the sand, I can actually click on this field right here. And then once I make the click, I can, as you can see, move over and select the area of interest. So for example, maybe I say, I'm going to go ahead and pick that mountain ridge on the back. And once I select that, now it gets locked right here. Another thing is you can actually zoom in and out of a particular area by just clicking that, and then you can also use your scrolling. So in this case, I'm just scrolling the mouse and getting to this particular area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now work on the sharpening and show you what's going to happen. And the reason why I picked this area is because it's going to be pretty obvious what the sharpening effect is going to do for that mountain ridge. So right here, we've got amount, and by default, Lightroom is going to give you 25 amount, 1 radius, and 25 detail, and 0 masking. And we'll go every single one of these in detail. So the first one is going to be amount, and what we're going to do is we're going to just try going all the way to the left, and as you can see, as soon as I did that, this actually, the detail went away. So by default, if it's 25, it's already applying some sharpening to the image. Now, if I yank that all the way to the right side, look at what happened. And let me actually zoom in both on this image as well, just to show you the effect here. So as you can see, as soon as I raised that to 150, a lot of sharpening got added. And if I go back and forth and actually maybe just turn this off and turn it on, as you can see, the change is pretty drastic. So you have to be very careful. Sharpening is basically how much sharpening gets generally applied to the image. And going to 0 means there's no sharpening applied, period, and going to 150 is using the maximum sharpening potential here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually scale it down, and we'll leave it roughly at around 30. We'll talk about radius next. So what is radius? Now radius is how much the sharpening gets applied around the pixel. So by default, it's set to 1 pixel, which means especially around the edges here, it means that it's going to look at edge detail and it's not going to go over 1 pixel. And I'll show you how that works. So if I go and increase this to say the maximum 3 pixels, look at what happened here on the top, especially if I'm going to increase the sharpening just a little bit. Let's just raise that around 50. Now, as you can see here, we just got this really nasty looking like halo. And the reason why this happened is because it's looking at the edge detail and it's saying, well, I'm going to now use 3 pixels total to add that sharpening. So it's adding 3 pixels right around this edge. And if I lower it down, you'll see how that's going to change. So let's take it down to the minimum and boom, that halo is gone. So the halo, if you see a drastic effect of sharpening and you start seeing these white outlines around your edges, you will know that you probably went too high on the radius. So that's what the radius does. Let's go ahead and bring it back to the default 1. Then the next thing we have is detail. Now the detail slider, as the name suggests, is something that controls how much sharpening gets applied to edges or the details of the image. So a small number is going to only apply sharpening to maybe the bigger edges, and then the larger number, say if you yank it up all the way to 100, is going to apply sharpening even to the smallest details. And in this image, we have both. We have these mountain ridges here, and then we have sand, really fine sand, especially in the foreground. And I'll show you what that's going to do. So if we start out from detail 0, so if I'm going to go back all the way, as you can see, it kind of mushes these areas a little bit. It does not bring out much. But if I say I want to go all the way to 100, look at what it did to these areas in here. So if I just move this maybe just a little bit lower so you can see how that's going to affect that, as you can see, it now is going to apply sharpening all the way throughout the image, even in the smallest areas. So if I now move down here and let's take a look at the sand, as we can see, there are a bunch of areas right here that are really fine. You will see what the detail slider is going to do. I'm going to go back to 0, and as you can see, it becomes a little bit cloudier even, and it's not as sharp, and these small details aren't really touched. But when I bring that up to 100, it just became so much sharper. So you can see the difference is pretty drastic. Now, why is this important? Say you were photographing a subject like a bird. If you're a bird photographer, then feather detail is obviously very important. And with this detail, if you're going to leave it at 100, then, or if you're going to leave it at 0, in fact, it's going to most likely just outline the edges of the bird, and that's the area that's going to get sharpened. But the extreme feather detail, the really fine details, might not get touched. On the other hand, if you're going to bring that to 100, it's going to look at even the smallest details on the feathers and is going to try to sharpen those areas as well. So now there's one important thing here, is that when you start working with sharpening within Lightroom, you're going to play between the amount and the detail quite a bit. And the balance between the two is quite important, because if you're going to go really high on detail and really high on sharpening, you're going to introduce a lot of artifacts to the image. Let me show you how that looks. So if I set it to 100 detail, and you can see all this detail right here in the sand, and if I now bring up sharpening way too high, look at that. Now we are not dealing with sharpening just the sand and the small particles. We're literally introducing noise all over the image. And I can show you how that looks like if I zoom out, and now if I look at the areas which should not have any noise whatsoever, like the clouds, you can see that we have a lot of these really weird looking dots all over the place. So we just added artificial noise just by going crazy on that sharpening. So this is something you have to keep in mind. You should never keep that amount and detail way too high, because then it's going to take everything and then it's going to add noise where it doesn't exist, or it didn't exist before we even started. Now next, let's talk about how you can balance these things, right? And this is something that you're gonna have to try and see what works out best for each image because it depends on each individual image. If I'm starting out with an image that has a lot of noise and I'm trying to work out and try to introduce more sharpening, it's going to be difficult. And for that reason, if you have a noisy image, maybe that has already high levels of grain just because you use a very high ISO, you might either skip sharpening completely because then you're going to deal with all those dots in the image, and the software cannot differentiate between the noise that came from the camera or the noise that's getting added through the details. So what it's going to do is going to try to add detail to everything, including noise. Then you're going to deal with a lot of problems. So the preferred method is, if you have a high ISO image, it's probably best to run noise reduction first, and which we'll talk about next, and then after noise reduction is applied, then start recovering some of the sharpening through the sharpening area here. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, another thing that I want to point out is that if you're dealing with a regular image, so in this case, I don't have a high ISO image, obviously this amount and detail is something that I have to balance. And how do I do that? So there are multiple methods to deal with this. One method is to say, well, what is it that I want to bring out in this image? Because if I'm playing with the sharpening, remember, I'm not worried about outputting to the web, because if it's going to export the image, it's still going to downscale. None of these things are going to actually matter. But if I want to produce this for print, this is something that I'm going to have to see, and how much of that balance is going to work out the best. So for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this down. The sharpening is probably, I'm going to start around 25, the default value. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the radius lower, because remember, the radius, especially when you zoom in to a particular area here, and you're looking at the edge detail, if I'm going to go really high on that radius, it's going to create those weird looking halos. So typically, I want to start with something pretty low, maybe 0.5, which is half a pixel, which is just saying, look at the fine details and maybe just a little bit of sharpening, half a pixel of sharpening on those edges. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring detail all the way to 100. And that's what it's doing, is it's saying, well, try to sharpen everything, not just the large areas or not just the edges of the frame, but also sharpen all these little details like the sand, which is ultimately something that I want to do for this image. So this is one way of doing it. Now, as soon as I hit the detail to 100, and the radius is set to a lower value, this is where I start working with the sharpening. Now, I typically start right around 25, but you can go back to 0 and start scaling to the right. And what you're going to do is you're going to seek balance. What you want to do is you want to say, well, how much sharpening do I want to add in that amount field before the image starts getting noisy and you start introducing artificial noise to the image. So that's the balance that I'm going to try to look for in this image. So let's go back and start from 0, and as you can see at 0, there is nothing happening here. But as I start pushing the sharpening, and I'm now right around 40, and right around 50, maybe that's an okay, but even then I can see that there is a little bit of sharpening getting added. So even 50 in this case can be extreme. But if I move it even more, again, we're bringing back that noise to the image. So what I'm going to do is maybe scale it down to right around 30. Somewhere there. And now if we look at the details, so I'm going to zoom out and let's take a look at some of the detail level here. Now this is the foreground where I have some more dust and some more fine objects to play with. What I can do now is I can go back and forth and see what sharpening has done to this particular image. So with the amount of roughly 37, half a pixel radius, and detail about 100, I can turn this off. And this is where we started. As you can see, it's a very subtle change, but look at how it actually helped with the fine sand here. We can see a little bit more detail, and it's definitely something that's noticeable. Now, again, if I'm worried about just bringing out more details, especially around these bushes here, all I have to do is work on this amount, and then if I push it higher, then I can see more edge details. Another slider I've got here is masking, and this is a really powerful feature because what you can do is you can say, well, maybe I do not want to apply sharpening to the entire image. What if I wanted to apply sharpening only to selective parts of images? And that's something that you can do with the masking slider. Now let me show you how this works. If I'm going to just drag this from left to the right, you can't really see anything here. There's no effect. But if I look at the detail here, you can see that it's actually affecting the sharpening on that background. So why is it doing this? Well, the whole point of masking is, like I said, is to try to prevent the entire image from getting sharpening applied to it. So the key here is, in order for me to be able to see exactly what's happening on the entire image, is if I press the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on the PC, and if I hold on to it, as soon as I did that, as you can see, some things have changed here, but if I drag this now from the left side to the right side, it started at 0, which means apply sharpening to everything. And then if I moved all the way to the right, where most of the image is black, that's basically saying only apply sharpening to the areas that are still visible, which in this case is that ridge on the top of the image. So moving it all the way to the right means basically mask out everything and not apply sharpening there, and then keeping it at 0 means apply sharpening to everything. Now, what can we do with this? For this particular image, if I'm looking at it, okay, well, I did the sharpening, but maybe I do not want some areas touched at all, like this blue area of the sky here. Now, I have the clouds, and the clouds are actually really beautiful. They have very nice refined edges, and what I want to do is, when I start playing with this thing, you'll see that if I start moving the masking from the left side to the right side, the clouds are still going to be visible because they do have edges to them. So let me show you what that's going to look like. If I start from here from the left and then gradually start moving them to the right, I reach a point where I can actually get that sky in the background with the blue area of the sky completely black. And right there is going to be a pretty nice setting. Now, if I'm going to move it further, then what's happening is I'm essentially reducing sharpening on all other areas of the image, including the sand that I was playing with earlier in the foreground. So I do not want those areas to be touched, and maybe right around the setting around maybe 18 or so is going to be good enough for me. So if I leave it there, these areas that we're showing as black are now not getting sharpening at all. So basically here for this image, a lower masking of 18 is going to work fairly well. I do not want to push it further because then it kind of defeats the purpose of using sharpening, especially on the fine sand in the foreground. So one thing that I can do, if I have another image, for example, of a bird which is sitting in front of a beautiful background in the back, which is completely out of focus, well, what is the detail that I want to bring out? What type of sharpening do I want to do? Once I apply all these sharpening settings, I don't care about the background. I do not want anything in the background to be sharpened. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate just a bird. And in those cases, you might find a higher value of masking to actually work better. Earlier I said that there are a couple of other places in Lightroom where you can find sharpening tools, and one of them is going to be right here on the top. Now, if I use something like the adjustment brush, what I can do is I can paint certain areas and apply selective sharpening to those areas. So if I just use the slider right here and say I want to just isolate this foreground and just have the foreground sharpened and not the sky, I could technically paint all of that area, or maybe use even something like the graduated filter and then just drop it down and just ignore the sky and maybe only have the foreground. I can selectively apply sharpening by just moving the slider. So if I move the sharpness slider to the right, that applies sharpening, and then if I want to maybe reduce sharpening, I can just go to the left side. So the only main thing here, and the biggest difference between this tool and the sharpening tool down there that I showed you earlier, was that if you use any of these tools, you only have one setting. So technically speaking, you don't have as much capability for you to be able to work on those details. You cannot just play with the radius setting or the detail slider. You can't do those. You only have one sharpness setting. Now, the other area where you're going to find sharpening is going to be output sharpening, and that's where you actually export the image. Now, the reason why I earlier said that the sharpening settings here don't really matter is because when you reduce the image, the information is going to, a lot of the pixels are going to be reduced, maybe 10 pixels are going to be reduced to 1 pixel. During that transformation, the sharpening settings that you're going to have on the edges are most likely going to get lost. So what you're going to do is, during the sharpening phase of working with your image, if I'm exporting this image, for example, for the web, what I could do is come down here to the image output sharpening area right here, and I could say, I'm going to sharpen this for a specific purpose. Now, what that's going to do, once I downsample the image, as you can see right now, it's set to downsample to 2048 pixels on the long edge, which means this high resolution image is going to get much smaller. When that happens, on top of that, after the image is downsampled and got reduced to that size, it's going to apply specific sharpening. Now here, I could say it's going to be either screen or different type of paper. If I'm specifically printing on paper, I would select one of these. And then there's an amount field. And here you can set between low, standard, and high. So that's basically it when it comes to sharpening. Now I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of here, and we're going to cover this next section called noise reduction. Now, what is noise reduction? I'm sure you shot at high ISOs where you've seen grain in your images, and you probably wondered how you can reduce it. Well, there's two types of noise in images. The first one is called luminance noise, and that's where you see the grain, just the dots all over the image, especially at very high ISOs. And then the second type of noise is called chroma noise, and that one is just different patches of color that you see at high ISOs. So in Lightroom, you have the tools to be able to reduce that noise, and right here, the first thing that you're going to see is luminance. Let's talk about that now. Now, this image might not be the best candidate for reducing noise because it was shot at a very low ISO. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go back to the grid, and I'm going to click on all the photos, and let's find something that actually has a lot more noise. So I'm going to go ahead and just find something that has a very high ISO. So let's just scroll down here, and let's just pick this ISO 6400. That should be pretty noisy. So I'm going to go ahead and open this image. We're going to jump into the develop module, and I'm going to press D. And now let's see what we've got here. Now, this is a very classic example of what happens when you increase ISO too much, and this was shot at a very low light situation. So if I zoom in, you can see all these blotches here. This is what I was referring to earlier as chroma noise. And in addition to that, it has a lot of grain. So what we can do here is we can actually now practice these sliders and see what they're going to do. So let's take a look at what happens when we start playing with these sliders, and I'm going to start with luminance. And if I move it all the way to the right, it certainly does reduce the noise, but we still see all these blotches here. So maybe that's not where we start. I'm going to go ahead and undo that, and instead I'm going to start with color noise or chroma noise because I can clearly see the presence of that here. Now, what happens if we increase this to maybe roughly, looks like around 20 even, most of that stuff disappears. So I'm going to come back to this in a second, but let's play with this luminance now. I'm going to take this from left and move it all the way to the right and see what happens. Wow. Now that's a huge change. As you can see, all that noise, practically every grain that we saw before is now completely gone. What did that do to the image? If we zoom out, it now looks pretty smooth. Now, if this is the effect you're looking for, and maybe it's going to work, but the problem here is that by doing that, I actually killed a lot of information. I killed a lot of detail. And we can go back to this area and analyze this a little more. There is another slider in here, detail, and I'll talk about it for a second. But as you can see, going to 100 completely eliminates the noise from the image. Now, what happens if we play with this detail slider? Now, the detail slider says, well, either pay attention to details or maybe ignore the details as much as possible. If I'm going to move it all the way to the left, it's going to completely ignore all the details and apply that noise reduction everywhere. And as you can see, it actually got a lot smoother. At ISO 6400, this is actually, if I zoom into this area, it removed all the details from these pistachios here, so this is not good. And if I go back and if I had a portrait of a person shot at a high ISO, you would see that it would remove most of the features, and you would even blend their eyebrows and hair. It would look pretty nasty. So one thing that we can do is we can say, well, let's try to preserve some of that detail. And if I start moving this detail slider back, as you can see, some of the detail, actually I'm going to zoom out and zoom in on the pistachios here, I can actually see how much of that detail is going to come back. So right now, no detail whatsoever, and as I start bringing this back, you will start seeing more and more details on those pistachios. But, so if I wanted to say, well, maybe I want to preserve all the detail and move this all the way to the right, look at what it's going to do to that same area that we worked at. Look at these weird patches. And that's because it's actually now trying to preserve the detail even in the noise that we had before. So this is not good. Obviously, it's not going to work. So if I see this, I would actually work my way back and maybe from 100, try to get to the area where all of that stuff and junk disappears. So maybe right around, I want to say 60 is where it looks like it's good. And if I zoom into pistachios, that's actually not bad. I definitely still impacted the detail there, but it's not too bad. Now, the last slider that I've got here under the main noise reduction here is contrast. And what it does is it's going to affect the areas of contrast. Now, let's actually take a look at what happened. If I go back to luminance and set back to 0 or completely remove that, as you can see, the transitions between these bokeh dots here were very different. In fact, I actually had a bunch of detail that I completely lost. Now, if I go back to 100, all of that got smoothened out. This is now way, way too smooth. And in this case, what I can do, and I can say, well, you know what? I want to bring back some of that contrast. So if I start working on this slider, it's going to try to bring that contrast back. But as I do this, if I overdo it, it's going to introduce these weird blotches. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, while I was trying to bring back some of the details in the background and not have a super smooth image, as I try to recover the contrast, now I'm dealing with all these weird patches here, so that's not good either. Let's go back to this area right here and take a look at the effect. So once again, this is something that you're going to have to play with and see what works for a particular image. For this one in particular, if I move this over here, I'm not comfortable with seeing all these blotches. So I'm actually going to go ahead and reduce that back to right around maybe 10 or so. So that's looking fairly good. And now let's talk about the color slider right here. All right, now with the color, you saw what it did before. So if I go ahead and restore that back to 0, it kind of starts destroying everything that I've done under luminance. So this is something you keep in mind when you start playing with images and trying to do a noise reduction. You might be better off working with the color slider first, then you're not dealing with these weird color patches. So we're gonna go back to 24, that's where we're at. Now what happens if we move this all the way to the right? Well, it really doesn't do much because the color noise has been removed. But if you had an image that you shot at an extremely high ISO, then you might see the effect of this color going to a higher value. So detail is the same thing that is here. So if I start moving back and forth, depending on those color patches in the chroma noise or the color noise, you might want to go maybe lower or higher. So play with that setting, see what works out. And lastly, we've got smoothness. And again, this has to do only with the chroma noise here. So if I go back now and reduce the smoothness all the way to 0, as you can see now, it's actually not smoothing those areas out, and I can still see color blotches. And if I move this up higher, you will essentially see that can actually impact the detail level as well. So what I want to do is actually want to go back and keep it right around where we were at, which was in our case right around 50. I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I'm going to go back to the grid view, and I'm going to go back to our quick collection here. So what we have next is we have lens corrections. And this is something that definitely needs to be discussed in a little bit more detail because there are very powerful tools built in here to fix certain things. And in this particular image, I'll show you what this can do. So here we have a few tabs and then a few options in this window, and I'm going to go through all of these. But before I do that, let me first talk about lens corrections. What are lens corrections and why do we need them? Now, if you shoot with pretty much any type of lens out there, it most likely will require some type of lens correction in order to take care of some of the issues that optical lenses are going to have. And those issues could be things like lateral chromatic aberration, where you're going to have an outline around the edges of anything you shoot, that especially when it's a hard edge, where you could see something like a magenta or a green color outline right in those edges. And in order to take care of them, you need to be able to use software that automatically detects that and removes those types of issues. Other types of issues that you might have are vignetting, where some lenses will heavily vignette, compared to others. And then there's also going to be a problem potentially with distortion. When you shoot with wide angle lenses, those specifically will exhibit distortion, where a line is not going to show up as a straight line, but more like a curved line. And those can look really funky, especially when you photograph, for example, people. Just because of the distortion, people's faces might distort heavily just because of the lens. Now, keep in mind, this is different from perspective distortion, because if you're going to get too close to a person, their face is going to distort. But that is a little bit of a different issue, because here it's optical distortion. So in this case, how do we take care of these issues? Now, the good news is software like Lightroom has the built-in capability to be able to address such issues by just checking one check mark within this particular window, and I'll show you how that looks. You can automatically take care of most of the problems. Now, I'm going to jump into Lightroom and show you how we can do this. So for this particular example, I'm going to go ahead and zoom out, and we have a few tabs here. We've got Basic, Profile, Color, and Manual. Now here, the Basic tab is going to have a few options for you to be able to take care of things very quickly, and that's why it's called the Basic tab. So the first option we've got here is Enable Profile Corrections, and if I check that, Lightroom will read the information about this file, and it already knows what lens it was shot with, what focal length, and all that other information. When I imported the image, it's already inside the database, so it's going to try to match that against its database, and if it does find a matching profile, it will automatically apply to this image. So let's try this on this image real quick and see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and check that, and as you can see, nothing actually happened. Why is that? Well, most likely it was not able to find the correct profile. And if I go into the profile section, as you can see, that same check mark is checked here, and the lens profile couldn't be detected. When that happens, you will see that these fields will say none. Now, this particular image was shot with the Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter lens. I'm not exactly sure why the software couldn't find it, because as far as I know, the lens should be a part of the database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and come down here and pick Tamron, because that's the make. And as you can see, the image automatically changed. So I really don't know why exactly it couldn't detect that, but as soon as I did that, look at that. It picked from all these different lenses that are part of that database, the 15 to 30 millimeter lens, and that's exactly the one that I used for this particular shot. Now, if I go ahead and uncheck that and check that back, you can see that it's actually doing some corrections to the image. Now, this lens is actually a very good lens in terms of distortion, and it doesn't exhibit much distortion. So as soon as I did that, it fixed the vignetting, but the distortion is not visible. But if I'm going to go ahead and go back into my grid and pick another example, for example, this image that I shot with a very different lens, this was shot with a 24-70 millimeter lens. In that same field, if I go back to Basic and click on Enable Profile Corrections, as you can see, that was a pretty drastic change. So if I toggle, that is automatically taking care of the distortion as well. And distortion on this lens is going to be much stronger. So for certain lens combinations, you're going to have very severe difference in between how Lightroom applies the corrections and how the image looked like before you enable those corrections. And in other cases, it might be very subtle. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back to the image that I was working with earlier. The next thing we've got here is remove chromatic aberration. And the reason why it's there is because it's another problem that the lens correction module takes care of. Now, automatically, it's not going to remove it from the image. So what we can do here though, so by default, that is not checked, as you can see. And if I look at the outline here, I do see a little bit of chromatic aberration right here, so that you can see the outline looks a bit kind of yellowish here. So what I can do is, let's see what this does. I'm going to go ahead and click remove chromatic aberration. Boom, look at that. It just took care of that completely. So this is pretty smart. It knows if it sees things like that are easily correctable, it does take care of it. So if you look in this region right here one more time, I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that, and we can see that outline of yellow, and if I check that back, and boom, it's gone. So just with this check mark here, I can automatically take care of most chromatic aberration issues. Now, some lenses will exhibit really nasty characteristics with chromatic aberration characteristics, and if that happens, you might see several different types of chromatic aberration. You might see magenta, yellow, green, and so on and so forth, and there is a tool here where you can use that and fine-tune to try to remove all of those, and I'll show you that later. But for now, we're looking at this main screen. So the next thing we've got here is constrained crop. And this kind of doesn't make sense right now because if I'm going to turn it on and turn it off, nothing is actually going to happen. And the reason why is because it actually applies to certain things that I'm going to do here. And let me kind of give you a quick overview of these buttons right here. Now, one of the things that you can do in Lightroom, aside from the lens corrections, is you can have Lightroom automatically apply other corrections like level. So if I look at this button right here, level, what it will try to do, if I click on that, Lightroom will analyze the image, see if it can find anything that matches a horizon line, and try to level the image automatically. Then I've got other things like auto, vertical, and full. So let's take a look at what these actually do. Now, if you move the mouse over, it will actually show you what these tools do. So in this case, it says enable balance level, aspect ratio, and perspective corrections. So if I click on that, the software will try to do the leveling, and we'll try to do that with a balanced view. If the image is too unleveled, maybe it won't do that fully, but it says balance level, and then aspect ratio means it will try to preserve the aspect ratio, and then the perspective corrections means if it sees something like a building, it will try to correct that as well. So let's see if this auto is going to work for this image. And for some images, it's going to work okay. For others, it might not. But if I click on auto, as you can see, it mostly just tried to level it. And did it work for this image in particular? We can actually take a look. If I press the R button, which is going to put me into the crop option, and if I look at the angle, well, if we draw the horizon line, which in this case is roughly around that, it actually didn't do a very good job. So as you can see, that particular setting might not be very useful. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of that, and we're going to go ahead and undo that auto setting. But in other images, it can be actually pretty useful. Next, we've got level, and what level does is basically it's just going to do the leveling and nothing else. So if I click on that image, again, I'm back to where I was, and that's not desirable, and I'm going to go ahead and cancel it. But for the most part, if the horizon line is defined very well, it does a pretty decent job. In this case, it's trying to probably look at this side of the ridge and then this side of the ridge, and maybe that's how it's trying to level it. In any case, it's not working out for this particular image. Let's see what happens if we click on this vertical one. Now, the vertical level is it's going to basically apply the leveling, and then it will try to apply vertical perspective to an image. In this case, there's really not much to fix. We're going back to that same problem. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here and see, well, none of these images actually have something that we can use. But what if I went to photos and maybe just try to find something where it's pretty clear? So for example, this image right here. Now what I could do in this image, I could say, well, maybe we can try some of these. I can clearly see that although the level looks pretty good here, I know that there's perspective distortion in this particular image. So let's see what it does. I'm going to start with auto and see what happens. And as you can see, that's actually pretty good right there. If we look at before and then after, that's doing a pretty good job of trying to correct that perspective distortion, and it zoomed in a little bit because it's going to cut into those areas otherwise. But let's go ahead and cancel that. Try level. Well, the level is pretty good, so it's probably reusing that same line, doesn't do anything. And then we come to this vertical. Let's see what that does. Boom. Wow. Now that's a massive change. And the reason why it's a massive change is because it's trying to apply full vertical correction to the image, perspective distortion correction. And what it's doing is looking at those lines, which are clearly defined here on both sides, and it's trying to make them look the same, as if I'm standing on the same level and not shooting from bottom up. But at the same time, look at what it's doing. It's just introduced these white areas to the image. And the reason why that happens is because, well, there's no data there. If I undo this and look here, as you can see, it actually cuts off right here. That's the end of the line. And if I redo that, well, there's no data for it to be able to add extra information. It's just not there. So this is something you have to keep in mind. If you have a situation like this and it's adding that white border, well, the next step from here, and the only way you can do this, is you're gonna have to go into cropping, because otherwise, what am I gonna do with these white lines? And for that, there's a particular setting in here. Now remember I showed you the constraint crop, that it wasn't doing anything earlier, but in this case, if I say, well, what if I want to constrain the crop? The moment I click that, what it just did, it said, well, since that information is missing, I'm going to try to crop it as best as I can. And when it did that, as you can see, it actually cropped out a lot of the frame. And it's trying to fill as much as it can, but unfortunately, it's chopping off all this other information that I might not want to lose. So for me, well, this crop doesn't work because I actually want to see the bottom. So the only way for me to try to fix that is maybe to try to bring this up and then maybe bring this down. But even if I do that, in this case, that's as far as I can push it. Now I cannot push up and I lost the top. So this is something you have to keep in mind as you use this tool. It might be a bit too aggressive for subjects that are very close, but if you left enough space for some buildings, for example, it actually can do a pretty decent job. So let's explore now this last setting. I'm gonna go ahead and undo this. And lastly, we have full. Now what full does, it says full level, horizontal and vertical perspective corrections. Now, horizontal perspective is if you have a building that's crooked just because you were shooting it from the side, and vertical perspective is just like this when you're shooting from bottom up. And if you have a situation like that where you have a building that's going sideways and you have that pyramid effect of things looking bigger on the bottom and smaller on the top, it's going to try to fix both. Now, it just so happens that I actually do have an image that I can show you where we can demonstrate this effect. If I scroll up a little bit from my images from London, I do have this one image. Now, take a look at this one. This one has obviously vertical perspective distortion just because I was shooting up and I was shooting it sideways. So in this case, we have these lines kind of going from left to right, and then it's also going from bottom up. Now let's see what this tool does if I use the full functionality. If I click on that, now look at that. That's a pretty drastic change. What it tried to do now here, it applied both vertical and horizontal perspective correction to this image. And as you can see, that line is no longer going from left to right kind of crooked. It's straight now. And then it also tried to fix this by completely changing and trying to fix that vertical distortion. And by doing that now, these columns look vertical, these lines look horizontal, but that is not a good looking image. So in this case, while it tried to do its best to try to correct that, I would never use this image because it looks really weird. So this is something you have to keep in mind as you use these tools. Just experiment them with different types of environments and different types of images, and you might find that some things will work really well and other things might not work that well. Okay, so now let's go ahead and jump back into the image that we were using. So I'm gonna go ahead and go back to that same image that we were on, and I'm going to now scroll down. So after all this, let's take a look now at profile. So here, as I showed you earlier, you actually have different lens make, model, and profile, which you can apply to a particular image. If software cannot do it automatically, you select that from here. But in addition to the settings here, you also are given 2 additional sliders here. And these 2 additional sliders are for you to do additional corrections that maybe if they look a little bit too aggressive or maybe something isn't done to your liking, if the lines aren't straight even after the profile is applied, you can still do a little bit of post correction right here. So for example, with distortion, as you can see, as soon as I hover the mouse here, I've got this grid now. And if I start moving this to the left side or to the right side, it is going to try to fix, and if you can't really see it on a big scale, but look at the corners right here. In the very edges of the frame right here, it's a very subtle change, but it's definitely there. So keep this in mind. It's not going to drastically change things, but it will give you the flexibility to apply maybe some additional distortion correction. And the same thing with vignetting. If you feel that vignetting is not taken care of fully, as you can see, if I go to 200, now it's much brighter towards the edges of the frame. So if I go left, then it's trying to reduce that. If I go right, it's adding additional vignetting correction. So let's go ahead and undo that. And let's move on to the next section. So here we have color. And earlier, remember I said that when you apply chromatic aberration correction, this check mark basically corresponds to the same check mark in the basic tab. So under color, if I uncheck this and go back here, it's also unchecked here. So just something to keep in mind. I'm gonna go ahead and keep that checked. Now, one really cool thing that I have here, which in this case, it took care of all these problems, but if I had additional areas in the image that were not corrected as a result of automatic removal of chromatic aberration through this check mark, then I can use a few tools here. Now, I can manually select the type of aberration, and then I've got these different sliders here where I can do amount of purple, amount of green aberration, and then I have these different hue values that I can play with. Or the easiest way, I almost never actually touch these. The easiest way is if you do see some chromatic aberration around the edges and they're very visible, the best way is to use this tool. And if you click on this, it's called Fringe Color Selector, and if I click on it, I can actually go to the edges of the frame. So in this case, again, I have nothing to remove, all those issues are taken care of, but let's just say if I did, all I had to do is move over right where that transition is, and it gives you this magnifying tool which lets you select particular color, and if it's anything that it can take care of, if I click that, it will automatically take care of that chromatic aberration for me. So keep in mind that you can actually use this tool on multiple different areas. So you could do maybe one area, and if you see chromatic aberration in other parts of areas of the image, you can actually use the same tool to take care of that problem. All right, so that's pretty much it when it comes to color here and the chromatic aberration corrections. Let's hit now manual. Now manual is for situations where perhaps Lightroom does not have an automatic profile built in for you. And if you shoot with a specific combination, maybe you're using an older lens, or maybe it's too new of a lens and there's no update in Lightroom yet to provide that profile for you, what you could do is you could go to this manual tab here, and you could manually apply all these different types of changes. So you could do distortion correction, you could do vertical perspective, horizontal perspective, you could rotate it, scale it, and even change the aspect right here. And then you also have another option for constrain crop, which is going to be similar to the one in the basic tab. And lastly, we've got vignetting, which you can define the amount of vignetting and midpoint. So let's try to do this real quick, and I'll just demonstrate it on a different image, and perhaps maybe we can pick something like this one. And although we really don't have anything to fix, I'm just going to show you what this does. So the moment I go to distortion, just like before, now it's giving me the grid, and I can go left, and as you can see, that's really funky. Now it's trying to go apply super crazy amount of distortion on his face. And then if I go right, now what it's doing is it's now reversing that effect. So this is something obviously you do not want to do in this image, for example, but once you apply this correction, again, this constraint crop is going to be something that will remove these white areas if I don't want them. So if I click on that, now it kind of cropped that area away and just crop that center part of the image. I'm going to go ahead and undo that because neither are good for here. Next one is going to be a vertical perspective correction. And in this case, if I go left, what it's doing is trying to fix that same image. Remember, either shooting up or down. So if I were shooting a building from top to bottom or bottom to up, I can go either way to try to fix both of those issues. So keep that in mind. That's for that. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And then horizontal is going to be for those skewed buildings, right? So if you shoot from a side of a building and you have that type of distortion, as you can see, this allows going in both directions. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And then rotate is as you apply these things, you can also apply rotation at the same time. So if I do specific type of correction like a vertical or horizontal correction, sometimes I might need to rotate it and then apply a little bit more, and that's the flexibility. And then scale allows me to basically zoom in and out. And if there are going to be some images where you've got some really funky distortion, and scaling might actually save you from the hassle of doing constant cropping and all kinds of crazy stuff there. So that allows you to basically zoom in and out. And for those types of tools, you know, if you want to correct them, you need to provide enough information. So if you shoot a building, which you know you're going to be correcting later in post through these tools, you need to give enough space so that you don't run into the earlier issues that I pointed out, where there's simply not enough data to populate, and then you have to go into crazy cropping. So the last one we've got is aspect here. And this is just simply working with the aspect. As you can see, it's squeezing it or stretching it the other way, which again applies to corrections, and I'm not gonna mess with that. So lastly, we've got vignetting. And here it's going to be just manual vignetting correction. And again, this is just for the lens correction part. And I'm gonna go into post-crop vignetting a little bit later and explain how this works. But in this case, if I just wanted to apply subtle changes, as you can see, I can do that through here. And these are obviously manual corrections, and I can select a different midpoint, and then you will see that things will change as I go aggressive on that. The midpoint will determine on where vignetting starts. So I'm gonna go ahead and undo both of these because I don't want any of those. And that's basically it when it comes to lens corrections. Now, let's go ahead and jump back into our default image here. And let's take a look at what this did. So in the basic tab, we enable two things: profile corrections, which I manually went ahead and selected the lens. And then I also applied remove chromatic aberration setting here. Let's turn that off and turn that back on. And as you can see, the change is very subtle, but it's definitely there. And I'm not zooming into this area, but the chromatic aberration issues are also taken care of. Now, one specific thing I wanted to point out about lens corrections is that some lens profiles will be applied to images automatically, and there's no way for you to back out of that. And specifically, this happens quite a bit with mirrorless cameras. A lot of micro four thirds, for example, even some of the cameras like Fuji. When you go to this field and you check enable profile corrections, you might not see any difference at all. And if that happens and you go through and try to select it manually, don't even bother, because most likely those settings were applied to the image and simply you cannot see them. Now, you might not be aware that some lens corrections are applied automatically to your images, and this is not something that you can even control. So for example, in here, if you go to profile, you might notice that if I click on make, I don't see selections for Panasonic or Olympus. And there might be a few others that you might not be able to see here. What does it mean? It means that those changes, specific lenses from Panasonic and Olympus, it doesn't mean that Lightroom doesn't have support for them. It certainly does. But those changes are going to be pushed to you automatically. So if you come to this field and you shoot with one of those cameras, if you enable profile corrections and you see absolutely nothing happening, most likely that profile is already applied. And if I do go to an image that is shot with one of those cameras, you will actually see a note there that says that some corrections have been applied to the image. Now let me show you what it looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my grid and click on photos, and actually let's go to metadata here. And I know specifically that Olympus is going to be a camera that is going to have one of those automatically applied. So let's go ahead and go to develop on this particular image. And as you can see, the note says built-in lens profile applied. And if I move my mouse over, it allows me to click on that. It says click for more information. So let's go ahead and click on that. It says this raw file contains a built-in lens profile for correcting distortion. So the profile has already been applied. So this is something that you will see every once in a while. Now, if I go ahead and click this, as you can see, nothing happens because the profile has already been applied and there's nothing that I can apply further to the image. On other images, you will see a similar note, but it will only apply something like just chromatic aberration. So if this ever happens to you in Lightroom, now you know what's going on behind the scenes.